Hey grade 7s, welcome to your Friday math lesson. In our last lesson, we talked about how to take a fraction, convert it into a decimal, take that decimal, turn it into a percent, as well as how to take a percent or a decimal, change those into a fraction or the other missing link there. We're going to continue doing that a little bit. We're going to do our review, and then we're also going to talk about how to take a mixed number and turn that into a decimal and how to turn that into a percent. I touched a little bit on it in our last lesson. We're going to go into more detail about it, and that should pretty much conclude this unit. And starting Monday, we're going to go on to a new unit. So to take your fraction and to turn it into a decimal, you take your top number and you divide it by the bottom number. So that gives you your decimal. So 5 divided by 7 gives you 0.71 when it's rounded. So 0.71. To take that and to turn it into a percent, I take that number and I times it by 100. So times by 100, and that gives me 71%. And there you go. And as you noticed on our last worksheet, there was also, you had to put the fraction over 100. What it meant by that is when you have a percentage, let's say you got 71% of questions right on a quiz. That means you got 71 out of 100 possible points or 100 possible percent. So that's what it meant by putting it into a fraction over 100. And then your last step would have been to put that into lowest possible terms. Sometimes though, as you'll notice, if you have a decimal that has, 6, 7, 8, 9, 100 decimal spots after it, and you obviously rounded it, sometimes it doesn't fit perfectly into your original fraction. For example, 5 doesn't fit into 71 equally. And that's where it can get a little bit confusing, because if I'm trying to put 71 in lowest common terms, I can't, because 71 is actually a prime number. So it can only be divided by itself or 1. So that's why when you have fractions like this and you have to put them, usually the most accurate is when you've put it into a decimal and then taken that decimal and put it into a percent, and that would be the most accurate fraction to represent maybe like what you got on a test or something like that. However, these smaller fractions, they're still technically correct. It's just they're not as accurate to, 20, 30 decimal spots as it would be with just 1 or 2 decimal spots, something like that. So that's our first row. Now to take your percent and turn that into a decimal into a fraction, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can take 30 and you can put it over 100 and then put that into lowest common terms. So I can divide both by 2, for example, and just keep going until I can get into the lowest possible terms. Another way is if you wanted to put it into a decimal, you take the decimal spot here and you move it over 2 spots right here, which gives you 0.30, which is another way of being able to do it. And put it into a decimal spot. But this tends to be the most traditional way, is basically taking it, putting it over 100, and find the lowest common terms possible. And there we go. So 30 over 100, the lowest common terms, we have 15 over 50. I can divide both by 5, which gives me 3 over 10, and that's the lowest common term I can put it into. I could have also taken 30 over 100 and divided both by 10. So as you practice putting fractions into lowest common terms, you get a little bit better at being able to notice what numbers might fit into both. It just takes practice. Unfortunately, there's no crystal ball method that works for all the numbers, because sometimes you'll notice some numbers can divide into numbers that you may not even thought of. but it's all it is just it takes some practice. Now if we have our decimal and we want to put that into a percent and then take that percent and put it over 100, basically I have two options, timesing it by 100, or as you remember, some of you might remember from the last lesson, it's basically the same thing as taking this decimal and moving it 2 spots to the right. Because there's 2 zeros and 100, that means you move the decimal 2 spots over. Both get you the same result, which is 67%. Use the method that works best for you. If you want to times it by 100, do that. If you want to just move the decimal spot over a couple places, you can do that as well. They both work. Now with your decimal, or sorry, with your percent, you can put it over 100. Sorry, a little mistake there. So 67 over 100, and you put it into lowest common terms. In this case, 67 was actually a rounded decimal. So when you put 67 over 100, it will not divide into a lower common term equally because already in the lowest common terms because 67 is a prime number. However, when I took if the original mythical fraction was 2 divided by 3, which gave me 0.6666667, and I rounded it to 0.67. So the actual original fraction was 2 over 3. However, if you just gave me 67 over 100 because you couldn't put it into lower common terms, I would 100% accept that because I can't expect you to know what it was rounded to or what could have fit into it with the original fraction. So if you just left it at 67 over 100, would 100% accept that as a proper answer. So, and that's what we went over in our last lesson. Today we're going into our mixed numbers. If we're going to take a mixed number and turn that into a decimal and turn that into a percent, very similar process. I find the easiest way to do it is to take your whole number. Well, there's 2 ways you can do it. You can either turn this mixed fraction into an improper fraction, then divide by the top by the bottom. That creates your decimal, and then turn that into a percent. Or your whole number is going to be, so normally when you have your fraction, you put it into a decimal, it's 0 point something. If you have a mixed fraction, this whole number means that your first decimal spot is actually going to be 1 point something. In this case, because it's 2 wholes, it's actually going to be 2 point something. So you take whatever that whole number is and you put a decimal spot after, and then you're just figuring out what this decimal would be. That's one way to do it. The other way is putting that into a mixed number. So I'm going to do both ways to demonstrate. So in this case, I take my 1, I put it over here, I put a decimal spot after it, and I do 1 divided by 3, which gives me 0.33. So you have to make sure you don't put a 0 there. So you put whatever is after that decimal spot. So I see a 0.33. Don't worry about the 0 point, I just put the 33. That's the first way to do it. The other way is to put this into an improper. So 1 times 3 is 3, plus 1 is 4. So I have 4 over 3. Now I take 4 and divide it by 3. And that gives me 1.33. Both get me the right answer. So choose the method that you find is easiest for you or that makes the most sense to you. So I'm just going to erase this, and then we're going to go into changing that decimal into a percent. So to take it into a percent, I do the same thing. I times it by 100, or I move the decimal spot over 2 spots. So I get 133%. And there we go. Now, what if I gave you a percent and you have to change that into a fraction? Same thing, it's just going to be an improper fraction. So I take this percent, 133, and I put it over 100, and that gives me an improper fraction. To put it into proper terms, I put it into a mixed number. So I take, how many times can 100 fit into 133? It fits in once. There's 33 over 100 left, and I put it into lowest common terms. In this case, technically, this can be divided by 3, but 100 cannot. So that's where putting it into lowest common terms can be tricky, because technically it doesn't fit in properly. I know it can go down to 1 over 3, but 100 doesn't fit into 33 easily, doesn't fit into 3 easily. So in this case, I couldn't put it any lower. So if that's what you gave me as the final answer, I would still accept it, because technically speaking, I can't make this fraction any lower than it is, even though it can go into, even though my original number was 1 1/3. So on your homework sheets and everything, if you could only put it over 100 because you couldn't put it into a lower common term, that's 100% okay. So that's how we put our percentage into fraction. And you have to remember to put it into a mixed number, because that's a proper way to represent the fraction, whereas this would be improper. Now to take a percent and to turn it into a decimal, well, you got two choices. 133 divided by 100, or decimal, the invisible decimal after 133, move it 2 spots. So it ends up being 1.33. 133 divided by 100 gives me 1.33. Either way works. So now let's take our other fraction, which is 2 4/5. So my first method is I take my 2, I move it over here, put a decimal after it, and I take 4 divided by 5, which gives me 0.8. I don't have to worry about the 0 point, I just put the 8 there. Okay, because my original answer for this is 0.8. The 2 takes over that 0. The other option is put this into improper terms and then divide the top by a number. So 2 times 5 is 10, plus 4 is 14, over 5. 14 divided by 5 gives you 2.8. Now I take my decimal and I turn it into a percent. So 2.8 times 100 gives me 280%. Or I move the decimal spot 2 places over. If there's nothing here, it means a 0 takes its place. And that will also give me 280%. Take my percent and I want to take it into a fraction. Basically 280 over 100. How many times can 100 fit into 280 equally? Twice. So I have a 2. What's left is 80 over 100. And then I put it into lowest common terms. Right away I can see I can divide both of these numbers by 10. So that gives me 2 and 8 over 10. And I can divide both by 2, so that gives me 2 and 4 over 5. And in this case, I managed to get back to the same fraction that I originally got. So that's how we take it. Remember, if you are just taking your percent and turning it into a decimal, you just divide it by 100, or you move the decimal spot 2 places over. And that will give you a percent to a decimal. So that's what we're doing today, is mixed fractions. So you're going to have a worksheet that's going to be similar to the one from Wednesday. I'm going to continue posting these videos on YouTube, mainly because from what some of you guys have told me, it's less glitchy on YouTube, and sometimes on the VLE, the videos don't play very smoothly. So I'm happy to keep on putting it on YouTube. Let me know, guys, if you're having trouble keeping up with all the work. I know it's really tough kind of transitioning into this whole work from home. I'm trying to keep it as light as possible, that you're still doing about an hour for math 3 times a week, so 3 hours a week of math. So if I find that a lot of people are needing more time, or you're just not able to kind of complete it within a reasonable amount of time, I will work with you guys and make sure that you're still getting everything that you need to know, and we're able to kind of move through as quickly as possible, just because of how much is left in the curriculum before the end of the year. But that being said, I'm going to try to keep the homework fairly simple. So for example, like word questions, you don't have to give me full word answers. You can just give me the number. So that can also make it a little bit quicker for you. And we're going to kind of go on from there. So I know we're still kind of getting used to this whole VLE thing because it's so new. But I really hope you guys are doing well. From what I've heard and from what I've seen from what you guys have submitted, you've been doing super, super great. And it really warms my heart to see. So thank you guys so much. I hope you have an amazing weekend. Email me if you have questions. You guys have probably realized by now that I don't sleep at night. So I'm always kind of answering questions. If you do ask for a video for help, just keep in mind that sometimes it takes me a little while to set myself up to be able to do a video, or because we have a staff meeting, or because I have something else that needs to be kind of taken care of right at that moment. But trust me, I will get that video to you. It just may not be right away. All right, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and make sure you're taking care of yourselves, okay? All right, thank you guys.